Hello. This is to continue my look at resource mobilization and the Babi movement. This time we're going to cover organization and commitment. This comes from an old paper that Moojan, Momen and I wrote back in 1986 on the Babi movement, resource mobilization perspective. As a preface, let me note two general points. First, that there's still a lot of work to be done in the field of Babi studies. I'll give some of the modern academic studies a mention in the notes below. No doubt further research will add to our understanding of this complex movement. Secondly, the paper on which these remarks are based is primarily sociological in intent, to see in what ways a particular theory within the sociology of social movements is relevant to our understanding of the Babi movement. Apart from including original research on the social and ethnic composition of the Babi movement, its historical aspects largely reflect the academic work available to us at the time of writing. That's 35 years ago now. So, survival. For the leaders of a social movement to accomplish their objectives, it's generally necessary for them to ensure the movement's survival. Internally, this requires organization, member commitment, integration, and control. Externally, it also depends on the movement's relationship with the environing society, a feature I'll talk about in the sixth of these videos. Organization. To gain adherence to a movement requires the establishment of some sort of organization. Thus, the Bab addressed written and unsuccessful appeals for support to various religious and political leaders, including the Shah, but the main means of promulgating his claim was the missionary apparatus established by himself and his first 18 disciples, the Letters of the Living, the Huruf al-Hay. Some at least of these letters became important leaders within the movement. It is of note that in contrast to the clerical contenders for the leadership of the Sheikhi movement, the Bab and his inner circle of disciples had few of the advantages of established position. They had only limited access to existing networks of higher clerical contacts and patronage relationships. They had no circles of disciples or students to mobilize, and they had no local political power base to employ. They did, however, have access to the existing network of mosques and local Sheikhi communities. They were also able to utilize the commercial network of the Bab's merchant uncles as a means of communication, and they presumably had access to sufficient funds to further their immediate purposes, although that has not been researched properly. Thus, whilst the Bab was on pilgrimage, or later under house arrest, or otherwise restricted in his movements, his disciples dispersed throughout the greater part of Iran, but also to Iraq and India. Moving from town to town as itinerant propagandists, they embarked on an intensive missionary campaign. Acting as the movement's primary agents of diffusion, they established a network of Babi groups throughout the country. They secured and recorded conversions, disseminated the Bab's writings, and in some instances engaged in public confrontations with leading ulama. If and when they became more or less settled, they provided leadership for the local Babi groups. No system of formal organization was adopted for the emergent networks of Babi groups, however. The Bab would appear to have intended that his followers should be grouped into units of 19, the numerical equivalent of the word unity, wahed. The first unity was to consist of himself and the 18 letters of the living. Thereafter, successive groups of converts were to be formed into unities, and the unities further grouped into units of 361, that's 19 times 19, called kulushay, all things, a term with the numerical equivalence of 361. Beyond The first, or perhaps the second, Wahid, this cell-like structure in fact never appears to have come into being. Perhaps the missionary enterprise was itself so time-consuming and turbulent that the task of organization proved more difficult than expected. In any event, no uniform organizational system emerged. Where any of the letters of the living resided, they provided a focus for leadership, but elsewhere the local communities were led, if they were led at all, by individuals of established social standing. Usually these were Babi clerics, but merchants, landowners, officials, and courtiers might also act as informal leaders. In his later writings, the Bab also introduced a complex hierarchical system of spiritual ranks, consisting of various sequences of mirrors, muraya. Although several individuals were thus designated, no practical organizational system appears to have emerged. Commitment. All voluntary organizations face the problem of precariousness. Lacking the means of coercion, they depend for their existence on the continuing support of their members. To this end, an organization will generally develop distinctive commitment mechanisms. This is a piece of sociological jargon, I should say, to maintain its membership's motivation. In the case of the Babis, such mechanisms appear to have been mostly informal in nature. No conversion experience was necessarily demanded. There was no ceremonial initiation or requirement of public testimony of belief. Distinctive patterns of behavior appear to have been voluntarily undertaken rather than socially enforced, and in general, no vicinal or social segregation was demanded. Nevertheless, high levels of commitment were maintained, as evidenced both by the willingness of so many Babis to die for their faith, and more indirectly by Baha'u'llah's later reanimation of the movement after its seeming total collapse under the pressure of persecution. In the first instance, commitment appears to have been generated primarily by the movement's ideology. For devout Shi'is, recognition of the Imam, or his agent, was at the very center of religious meaning. To become one of the elect, who had attained such recognition in the age of the Mahdi, must of itself have constituted a powerful experience of commitment. The ideological distinction between believer and unbeliever doubtless reinforced this experience. Beyond such ideological factors, there were initially no uniform commitment mechanisms. The Bab called on his followers to perform various supererogatory acts of piety, additional prayers and fasts, abstinence from smoking, and the employment of distinctive rituals. But without social enforcement, the observation of such acts remained voluntary. Where such acts were observed, however, they were associated with very high levels of commitment. The group of Babi zealots surrounding Tahare in Karbala at one stage even refused to eat from the non-Babi bazaar, as they regarded it as ritually impure, I should say, sorry. Again, where conversion was closely linked to all-inclusive social networks, as in the Babi strongholds of Zanjan and Neriz, levels of commitment became very high. Here, being a Babi became an inherent part of normal daily life, and not a voluntary commitment to be renewed or abandoned at will. Given the uneven operation of such mechanisms, it's scarcely surprising that very different levels of commitment existed within the movement. Indeed, in Karbala, at least, such differences contributed to an acrimonious division within the local Babi community. Elsewhere, it's likely that groups of Babis simply varied in their commitment and ethos. Recruitment was to a particular local Babi group and should not be thought of as having been uniform in its implications. The pattern of commitment mechanisms changed as the Babi movement became more radical. Ideological ties with traditional Islamic expectations were broken as the movement's leaders asserted the reality of a new divine revelation. Social ties with non-Babis were strained as the movement's relationship with clerical and political authorities rapidly deteriorated. Those Babis who found the newly emerging ideological and social context unacceptable presumably lost commitment or defected. Those who remained were necessarily highly committed. The charismatic legitimation of Babi authority aided the acceptance of change. The constraints of traditional legitimation were disregarded. Psychologically, the sense of a separate identity is likely to have been enhanced. The abandonment of Islamic law, the Sharia, and participation in conflict with unbelievers again would have constituted definite bridge-burning acts. The experience of persecution underlined Babi separateness and stimulated communal identity and action. In the large and close-knit Babi communities, such as those at Zanjan and Neriz, social pressures to conform or depart may be assumed to have increased. Heroic martyrdom provided a powerful validation of Babi claims in Shi'i terms. Eventually, external definition by non-Babis reinforced the sense of separate identity, and in some cases may have made even leaving the movement difficult to accomplish. That's all I'm going to say for the moment. If you want to look at the sources for the various statements in this article, do look at the original published book. Anyway, many thanks for listening, and particularly thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which these videos wouldn't be made. And you're very welcome to support my channel. Do like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below for those who want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll talk about coordination. Have a good day.